Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. Go ahead. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, August 10th, 2024. We begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne. He's going to be joined on the line by Lewis Daro, retired associate professor of history at the Alliance Theological Seminary in New York City, and the world's leading authority on Abolitionist John Brown. Then, in the second half of our show, we'll be hearing from Robin Bernstein, Dillon Professor of History and Professor of African and African American History at Harvard University in Massachusetts, who's joining Dr. Horne on the line. For our purposes today, she's the author of the book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to please support our efforts here at KPFK. Let's hear from the Sultan of Study himself, Dr. Gerald Horne, with a message for those who want to make their contribution to the station.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell Magee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, in their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
So pick up the phone and dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Make your pledge and support our efforts here at Freedom Now. And of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Boyz II Men, Donald Byrd, John Coltrane, Wes Montgomery, Dorothy Ashby, and Bobby Hutcherson. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Lewis Daro.
For Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Lewis Daro, retired associate professor of history at the Alliance Theological Seminary in New York City, the world's leading authority on John Brown, including the book John Brown Speaks, Letters and Statements from Charlestown. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Lewis Daro.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. It's a pleasure to be with you and an honor to speak with you.
May not be familiar, John Brown in October 1859 led a multiracial assault in what is now West Virginia with the purpose to overthrow slavery by force of arms. Who was he? What was the plan? Why did this Euro-American man give his life to overthrow slavery and wind up having a broad boulevard in Haiti named after him? And how did you get involved in studying him?
Okay, I'll try to be succinct in saying that. Let me start by saying John Brown was a 19th century, in some respects, his life covers the just over the first half of the 19th century. During that time, the country really got worse, even though it was fundamentally corrupt by slavery and the compromise to sustain slavery. There was an optimism, at least among anti-slavery people, that the country would move toward ridding itself of slavery. But instead, as John Brown would later say, it became a slave nation due to legislation and judicial decisions that you're well aware of. And so John Brown, as a very devout Protestant Christian working in the tradition of the Protestant Reformation, however, personified a very, I think, unusual form of, and I'll use the term evangelicalism, an evangelicalism that was just as committed to the scripture and scriptural interpretation as were the Protestant reformers, and yet radically committed to mankind being the image of God, and therefore the idea that there's no ethical basis to support slavery. He saw that as part of his patriot. His grandfather was a colonial soldier. He thought that was a consistent expression, as did others. He wasn't the only one. So he would define himself primarily as doing a religious work, maybe in a sense the way Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman were heavily informed by religious conviction, or maybe saw their work as religious work. He was not a political abolitionist, although he had obviously strong political interests and actions. I would parallel him, strangely enough, with Malcolm X, insofar as they were men of personal religious, conservative religious ideas that become intermixed with radical political action, radical critique of society. And those people don't happen, as you know, all the time. John Brown was an evangelical by all accounts, but he's hated by evangelicals today because most of evangelicalism today is white nationalism. As Malcolm X said, John Brown was a counter-white nationalist. He believed that his Christianity was best expressed in the Golden Rule, and he felt that black people were just as capable of fighting for their freedom as were his own white forefathers, and so he wanted to expedite that. So the Harper's Ferry raid. Now, I hold the position, Doc, if you don't mind me saying, that I really disagree with a lot of the received narrative, keeping in mind that the narrative came down from the Virginia and pro-slavery press, which is the first draft of history. It was mediated through the Mason Report, the congressional report conducted by Virginia Senator James Mason to try to incriminate the Republicans for John Brown's raid, and then went into the history books by conservative, Southern, and right-wing historians who wanted to elevate Abraham Lincoln and suppress John Brown's memory. And so what we have received is a very, I think, problematic narrative of the Harper's Ferry raid. Maybe one of the most essential pieces that I deny is that John Brown did not raid the armory to take weapons to arm thousands of black people, which is often what has been taught. He actually didn't. He actually did it, in my opinion, and I do address this in my book, Freedom's Dawn, The Last Days of John Brown in Virginia. I also, if I may say this, I sustain a John Brown Today podcast. And if you want to hear more of my going on and on about these things, check out John Brown Today. And these questions are unpacked in detail. But I think John Brown was trying to launch a Southwide liberation movement, but I think he primarily wanted to kind of use an Underground Railroad model in reverse. And I think he wanted to arm people so that they could fight defensively, but I don't think that it was primarily an insurrection. John Brown denied it was an insurrection, and he made no provision for an insurrectionary war. In that sense, he's different from Nat Turner, who really was, for justifiable reasons, conducting a war, a servile war, in which he killed slave masters and their children in order to liberate himself and others. John Brown wanted to destabilize the function of slavery. He wanted to bring slavery into, the idea of sabotage, of throwing the wooden shoe into the mechanisms to stop it. He wanted to throw the South into a paralysis by leading off continually more and more and more enslaved people. And then, as James Redpath, the abolitionist, said, he wanted to put into effect the Constitution as he understood it and the Declaration of Independence as he understood it from Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico. My interest in John Brown came from being first a student and biographer of Malcolm X. I am a Christian. I taught theology and religious history. I love Malcolm X. He made a big impact on my life. And at some point, it occurred to me, based on what Malcolm X said and his criterion for evaluating good white people or good people and bad people. He said, as you know, when the media says people are good, those are the people you should be wary of. And so I began to look at John Brown more closely. And after I felt that I had done the work that I could do on Malcolm X, I really took up John Brown and then found that I had a niche that needed to be developed because he has been such a victim of a hackneyed, misrepresented, often quite, unfair and biased representation. I think a lot of the biographies that have been done, there are some good ones, and I can certainly say David Reynolds, John Brown Abolitionist, is a better than most, maybe even the best one. I wrote a biography too, but his is the most well-known, the most prominent. But many other biographers have some kind of ideological chip on their shoulder. And so John Brown really needed a great deal more help. Malcolm X didn't need me. John Brown really needed my help. And I've devoted the past 25 years to working. And so I've written a handful of books. I continue to hope to write more. I have been working on his letters. I have transcribed and tracked down every letter, every document I can of John Brown. I hope to publish that before I cross over the Jordan. But while I'm here, I still want to do a book on John Brown in Kansas, and I want to do a book on the full last 3 years of his life, because the story has not been adequately told. I've gone deep, and so because I've gone deep, I have been very much kind of in a place where I'm always fighting uphill against what I think are just the extensive prejudices in white society toward John Brown. We could talk about that nonsensical series that Ethan Hawke did based on a nonsensical fictional novel, The Good Lord Bird, which was actually written as a kind of avoidance of history. The author, whose name escapes me, very clearly said...
James McBride.
Thank you. James McBride, who's a very talented man, and I bear him no personal malice, but James McBride said in interviews more than once that he did not want to kind of treat history like, here, take your medicine. What he wanted to do was have fun. And so he made Frederick Douglass look like, some kind of prima donna, and the TV series made him look even worse. And he made John Brown look, see, the older images, if you go back to Santa Fe Trail, 1940, Raymond Massey was a sympathetic madman at the end of that movie playing John Brown. Here we have Ethan Hawke playing a kind of sympathetic madman redux. And so I didn't like the series, or at least I disliked most of it. We haven't had a good movie on John Brown yet. I keep hoping someday someone will do a movie about John Brown. But because he just does not make society comfortable. He doesn't make white society comfortable because he doesn't behave the way they either want or understand. Because he believed in black liberation, and he believed that black people not only had the ability to fight for themselves, that they would fight for themselves if properly equipped, if enabled, and so he was exceptional in that regard. He also he did believe in the use of violence, but he believed in the use of violence only in response to pro-slavery violence, really terrorism, as he did in Kansas. And again, that's a different take I have. And I talk about it in my podcast. I don't, you know, you know that they typically, on any documentary, you see these PBS documentaries, they typically rush you from John Brown, a failed businessman, to Kansas, where he kills 5 people, and then off to Harper's Ferry, and then they're done with him. Well, every one of those aspects of his biography are just riddled with errors and wrongs. And so my own position is that John Brown, while not the only figure, there were a handful of white men and women in that era who were truly egalitarian and radical, like Gerrit Smith, who supported John Brown, and some others. But for the most part, as you well know, as such a profound historian, you know that even what was considered Free State or the North was fundamentally a racist society that was Afrophobic, or maybe in that time, Negrophobic. They didn't want black people around, even though they didn't want slavery, because they didn't want black people around. Lincoln was like that himself. Mm-hmm. So John Brown wasn't like that. John Brown enjoyed black people. He enjoyed their humor. He had many, many black friends, not just the famous ones, but a lot of folks that, you know, you can dig in the history and find them out. He knew his way around black communities from Philadelphia to Detroit. And he clashed with black people as well sometimes. He disagreed with them, but he did so as an eye to eye, as a man to man. I mean, and that was a mark, I think, of his integrity, that he could, for instance, he could take issue with Frederick Douglass, and they had a little bit of a falling out toward the end, but he loved him and Douglass loved him. And the proof of that is, look at what Douglass wrote about Brown in the years after his death.
After his hanging. And in fact, one of his comrades was a black man by the name of Osborne Anderson,
yes,
who was with him on that fateful day in October 1859. But unlike John Brown, who was captured and then hung, Osborne Anderson escaped and then wrote about the raid, quote unquote, and in fact talks in descriptive terms about getting the drop on a descendant of George Washington, of all people, who then began to snivel and grovel like an infant. Talk to us about Osborne Anderson, Shields Green, Dangerfield Newby, and some of John Brown's black comrades.
Yes. Well, there were 5 black men who ultimately came. Others said they were going to come. Harriet Tubman had enlisted some, but there was a hiatus. He wasn't able to do the raid when he wanted to. And by the time he got around to it, 5 men from the black community with very different profiles in a lot of respects. 2 of them, Osborne Anderson, as you know, he was originally from Pennsylvania, and he was a refugee from the United States in Chatham, Ontario. And then you have John Anthony Copeland and Louis Leary, who were from the Oberlin set in Ohio. And then my favorite, Emperor, or Shields Green, who I actually did a little book on NYU Press about Shields Green, because he's the most mysterious of the raiders. We don't even have a photograph of him. We have a photograph of every other raider. And then, of course, there was Dangerfield Newby, whose family was from Virginia, but as you know, Virginia would not tolerate free blacks, and so Newby's family had to leave Virginia, and so these 5 black men, I think, all noble. As a matter of fact, you know, Doc, if you don't mind me saying, people always say remember the Alamo. I say remember Harper's Ferry. I think that Harper's Ferry is the paradigm of what we should be remembering, where a small group of men, white and black together, fought and died and paid the price, not a group of land pirates and slaveholders in Texas. That's my opinion, but I say that these 5 men were all wonderful. Osborne Anderson was working in the publishing business. He worked with a black woman whose name right now shamefully escapes me, who was in Chatham and worked on a newspaper there. And John Brown held what he called a quiet convention in Chatham, Ontario in May of 1858. expecting that he would shortly go to Harper's Ferry. As I said, he was forced into a hiatus. He was nearly betrayed, and so he had to do diversionary tactics, and he went west, and he lost a lot of black enlistees because of a whole year. But in Chatham, there were 30-something black men, many of them Chatham and refugees in Canada, and others who were coming across because there was a lot of fluid movement back and forth between Detroit and the black leaders of Detroit going back and forth as well. Douglass did not go, so most of the men, most famously was the wonderful black nationalist forefather Martin Delany, who John Brown sought out and who he was close to as well. And so he had a constitution that he drafted. He wrote that, in fact, in the home of Frederick Douglass. Douglass would later say that Brown was so fixated on this that it almost drove him a little crazy to have John Brown in the house. John Brown was a very single-minded man, and sometimes it's hard for him to kind of get off that. So he was very committed. He brought that constitution to Chatham. It was approved. And then in quiet conversation among the black leaders in Chatham, they were not really confident. They did not necessarily want to encourage lots of people to go because they felt that it was very risky. And it was risky. But Osborne Anderson was willing to go, and he came from Chatham. And as you mentioned, he survived and he escaped on a reverse trek on the Underground Railroad. I mean, on a alternative kind of approach, but he took the Underground Railroad up into Pennsylvania and made it back into Ontario. And he wrote a book called A Voice from Harper's Ferry, which was published in 1860, which is the only narrative provided by a Harper's Ferry participant. And it is it's not a long book, but it's very rich. You can even find it on the internet, the internet library, the internet archive. You can find it there. It's been published, I think, by some others. And what he says essentially is I think, well greeted. And he also can criticize John Brown, that John Brown delayed too long. And that really was the source of his failure. He was overly ponderous in some other reasons, which I talk about in my podcast, that he delayed so long that he entrapped himself. He also made the mistake of moving his white slaveholder hostages into the engine house. He felt extremely concerned for their health, and so it was cold. He moved them into the engine house with a fire, and that was a strategic. So let me put it this way. John Brown was a wonderful strategist, but he really was not a good tactical man, and he failed. I believe if Harriet Tubman had been with him, she would have put a fire under his butt and got him going.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there,
yes.
Professor Decaro. Appropriately enough, talking about Harriet Tubman, retired associate professor of history at Alliance Theological Seminary in Manhattan, the leading authority on John Brown, and of course, one of his many books includes John Brown Speaks, Letters and Statements from Charlestown. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Los Angeles.
You're most welcome, Doctor. I salute you.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Professor Decaro for sharing his work with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Dr. Horne, talk to the people about what they can expect as a thank you for donating to the station, KPFK, today.
Pledge a mere $100 and receive as a thank you gift the latest book from Gerald Horne, hot off the presses, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Read about the distinctions drawn between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Read the first detailed analysis of the shootout at the UCLA campus in January 1969, leaving 2 Panthers dead. Read the first detailed analysis of the LAPD attack on Panther headquarters in December 1969. Read the first detailed analysis of the August 1970 shootout at the Marin County Courthouse, featuring Pasadena teenager Jonathan Jackson in an alleged attempt to free his elder brother, George Jackson, and read of the role of the recently deceased political prisoner, Ruchell Magee. Read the first detailed analysis of the attempt at UCLA to fire Professor Angela Davis because of her membership in the U.S. Communist Party and her subsequent trial when she was charged with murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping during the aforementioned county courthouse shootout. Read the first detailed analysis of the Panthers' embassy abroad in Algeria, led by Eldridge Cleaver of Pasadena and Watts, in their attempt to build global solidarity for the Black liberation struggle. Read of the Panthers' solidarity delegations to the nation then known as the People's Republic of the Congo in Brazzaville, and of the Panthers' exile in socialist Cuba. Read of the connections between Hollywood communists and progressives, such as screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, actor Jane Fonda, actor Gene Seberg, screenwriter Donald Freed, basketball star Bill Walton, and producer Bert Schneider, and their support for the Panthers. Read of the severe repression visited upon radical and left-wing forces, which set the stage for the rise of paramilitary forces, often depicted as gangs, and the concomitant rise of the drug epidemic, especially crack cocaine. Read the first detailed analysis of the NAACP chapter in LA, especially the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch, which was a cash cow for the national organization, not least because of the contributions from celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. Read of the roots of Kwanzaa, the nationally celebrated Black American holiday. Above all, understand why historically Southern California has been in the vanguard of radicalism and revolutionary upsurges, and how that spirit has yet to be squashed. Again, pledge a mere $100 and receive a signed copy of the latest book by Gerald Horne, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
So pick up the phone and dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, getting right back into it, we're going to send you right back off to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined by Professor Robin Bernstein. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Robin Bernstein, Dillon Professor of History and Professor of African and African American History and Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University in Massachusetts, and author of the book Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles, Professor Bernstein.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because I discovered something that surprised me. I discovered the story of William Freeman. He is the title character in Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. I discovered that when he was 15 years old in 1840 in New York State, he was convicted of a horse theft that he swore he did not commit, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor as a convict who would be leased in a prison in New York State. He was going to be leased, his labor was going to be leased to private companies for profit, and he would be paid nothing. And I thought, when I learned about this story, I thought, what? Convict leasing in the North? Decades before the Civil War? I always thought that convict leasing was an invention of the South after the Civil War. I thought it was quote unquote slavery by another name. I thought it was a product of the 13th Amendment. How could prison for profit and convict leasing exist in the North so long before the Civil War? And that started me thinking, well, if I didn't know that prison for profit was actually invented in the North long before the 13th Amendment, then I bet a lot of other people didn't know that either. So I wrote the book to tell that story.
So talk to us more about William Freeman. This apparent horse theft was not the only crime he was accused of, as I understand it.
That's right. He was a teenager, and he grew up in Auburn, New York, which was at the time a tiny little village in the Finger Lakes area of New York. He grew up in a close-knit Black community in a neighborhood called New Guinea. The Black neighborhood of Auburn had actually been established by his grandparents. His grandparents were enslaved. Their names were Harry and Kate, and later when they became free, they chose the last name Freeman, which tells you a lot about what was important to them and how they thought about themselves. So they developed this community, they established the community, and they grew a family, and they gradually became free as part of New York's gradual emancipation process. So William grew up in this close-knit community. He was loved. He was well known as the grandson of the people who founded the Black neighborhood. He also had some difficulties. He had his father died when he was quite young. His mother had a lot of difficulty taking care of him. And he got into some trouble. He was accused of stealing chickens. He was accused of some minor crimes that are really not that unusual for a teenager. But then everything changed in 1840 when he was accused of a serious crime, which was a horse theft. There was no evidence against him beyond the accusation itself, but it didn't matter. He was convicted, and he was sent to 5 years in the Auburn State Prison, which was the prison that had invented the idea that a prison can be a capitalist institution.
Now, was there a connection between the end of slavery in the North in a place like New York State and the rise of for-profit prisons?
There was. So when we hear about prison for profit being, quote, slavery by another name, unquote, that is absolutely true. Prison for profit arose in the North in the wake of slavery, in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. So there was a definite relationship, there was a definite context. What would not be accurate is to say that prison for profit arose as a simple substitution for slavery. It would be more accurate to say that prison for profit arose in the North as part of a series of transformations. The North was transforming into an industrial economy. It was transforming into an economy governed by state capitalism, meaning that the state understands one of its central goals, one of its central purposes to be stimulating the economy. And so New York State in particular was in the process of moving from being an economy based on slavery to an economy based on state capitalism. And the Auburn State Prison, the original prison for profit, was an important part of that transformation.
So as I understand it, Mr. Freeman demanded wages while he was in prison, and his challenge triggered violence, first against him, then by him. He was accused of a quadruple murder. Take it from there in terms of what that leads to.
Sure. So William Freeman was incarcerated, and he was put to work in prison factories. These were factories that were built into the prison for the purpose of generating profits for private companies. William Freeman, at the age of 15, was specifically set to making animal harnesses. And what he was doing was filing iron 12 hours a day for no pay at all. So this was basically a form of slavery, and he seems to have understood that very clearly and have been very angry about it. Remember, his grandparents were enslaved, his father was enslaved and had become free, his mother had always been free, and William Freeman had always been free. His family had, over 3 generations, become free, and here he was, basically re-enslaved, forced to labor for no profit for himself, lots of profit for other people, but no benefit for himself whatsoever. And he was incensed. So he resisted. He resisted immediately upon entering the prison. And the Auburn State Prison was an enormously violent place. And any kind of resistance or infraction met with terrible retribution. And that was the case for William Freeman. He was whipped, he was waterboarded, and in the worst instance, he was beaten over the head by a guard. And the beating was so terrible that he sustained a brain injury, and he also became deaf as a result of that injury. So when he got out of prison, he was very angry and he wanted to recover wages. Interestingly, he was more angry about the theft of his wages. As he saw it, his labor had been stolen from him. He had been enslaved. And he was more angry about that than he was about his injuries. And so he got out of prison and he tried to recover lost wages. He appealed to magistrates. He tried to go through legal processes to get what he saw as legally his. And he was laughed at and he was dismissed. And after 6 months of legal efforts and being laughed at and dismissed, he turned to violence. William Freeman committed a quadruple murder, and when I say that, I'm not giving away anything. The murder is in the title of the book, and the fact that William Freeman does commit a horrific crime, that's in the very opening of the book. So the book isn't about whether he's going to commit this crime. The book is about how he comes to that, how he is forced into that position where that seems like his best option for challenging the Auburn State Prison. And then the book is also about what happens next. When William Freeman challenged the Auburn State Prison, he wasn't just challenging a prison, he was challenging an economic system that all of Auburn, and in fact all of New York State, and increasingly all of the United States depended on. The Auburn State Prison had made the town of Auburn, first the village, into a town, and then it had made the town into a city. It had made the city prosperous. And the entire town was economically dependent on the prison. The prison was also the source of the city's pride and international fame because the Auburn State Prison and its system of prison for profit was being imitated literally all over the world. So he challenged an economic force. He challenged the pride of the people in the city. He challenged their very identity. And nobody wanted to hear William Freeman's challenge. If somebody is saying something that you really don't want to hear, it's not that easy to simply silence them. Instead, what you really have to do is come up with your own counter narrative. So after William Freeman committed this terrible act, this murder, the people of the town, in particular the white people, but not only the white people, had to come up with a different story for why he did what he did, because he was saying why he did what he did. He was saying that he was challenging the prison, but they didn't want to hear that. They had to come up with an alternative story. And the alternative story that the white people in Auburn invented, totally from their own imaginations with no evidence whatsoever, the story that they invented, of course, was that he did it because of blackness, that he did it because of race. And in particular, the story that they came up with was the racist libel that we all know so well today, but was at the time quite new. And that was the racist libel that there is some sort of inherent connection between blackness and criminality, that there was something racial in William Freeman because he was both black and he was also Native American, that there was something racial in him having to do with his blackness and his indigenous ancestry. that made him commit this murder. And this was a very powerful, but then at the time, very novel racist idea. And it got articulated through his trial for murder, which was spread throughout the entire country. Trial transcripts were published throughout the country. And this was an inaugural moment in the creation and the dissemination of this horrible racist idea that remains so pervasive today.
So what befalls William Freeman in the aftermath of this trial?
Well, it's not pretty. William Freeman, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but he has enormous difficulties, and it is not a happy ending. What happens throughout the trial is basically that his challenge to the Auburn State Prison is squashed. And to me, that's one of the great tragedies of the book, that William Freeman was saying something urgent, something important, something that we all should be listening to today. People who were alive at the time should have listened to him then, and we should be listening today. And what I'm trying to do in this book is hear William Freeman, hear his challenge to the Auburn State Prison, and hear his challenge to prison for profit. He was experiencing a system that still exists today and that is more entrenched today than it was in 1840 when William Freeman was incarcerated. And he should have been listened to then, and it's our job to listen to him now.
So what percentage of prisoners in these institutions, at least in New York State, were Black?
Black people were overrepresented in the Auburn State Prison almost from the beginning. The very first set of prisoners who were incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison, the very first set, seems to have been entirely white. So that's what I mean when I say that the Auburn State Prison was not invented for the purpose of re-enslaving Black people. It was invented for the purpose of transforming Auburn from a village into a city. It was invented for the purpose of making a specific set of white entrepreneurs rich. It was invented for the purpose of generating funds for private corporations and for the state. So originally, at the very beginning, it wasn't about race, it was about capitalism. But that changed really fast. As soon as the Auburn State Prison existed, it very quickly became a tool by which to re-enslave African Americans. It became a tool for racism. So the percentage of African Americans in the Auburn State Prison rose throughout the 19th century. And at the time that William Freeman was incarcerated from 1840 to 1845, Black men, and they were all men, they constituted approximately 11% of the prison. And for contrast, Black people constituted approximately 2% of the population of New York State at the time. So this was roughly a fourfold, or actually more than a fourfold overrepresentation. However, it's really important to think about the fact that this was long before mass incarceration. So the actual numbers of people in general in the prison were so much lower than we are accustomed to now. So it was a tool of racism, and that grew throughout the century. Black people became more represented, more overrepresented in the prison, and as the century went on, more people were imprisoned. So this was something that changed over time, and it changed absolutely consistently in the direction of racism.
So who was Harriet Tubman, and what role does she play in your book?
Thank you for asking that. Harriet Tubman is known as the Great Emancipator. She's known as Moses. She was an enslaved woman who freed herself And she freed herself, and then she went back many times to the South, and she was enslaved in the South. And she went back to the South many times and freed many, many members of her family and many other people, and was much lauded and still is to this day much lauded for her bravery and her genius. She also was a spy during the Civil War on the side of the North, obviously. So the reason that Harriet Tubman is important to my book, many, many people have heard of Harriet Tubman. Many, many people know about Harriet Tubman. And quite a few people know that Harriet Tubman, when in her freedom, she settled in Auburn, New York, which is the home of the Auburn State Prison. She bought land there, and she actually bought land from the wife of the man who defended William Freeman in court. That's William Henry Seward, who was later Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. So Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn. She settled there in the 1850s, and she lived there until her passing in 1913. But what's really amazing to think about, and the thing that I think about a lot in the book, is the fact that she chose to live just 2 miles away from the Auburn State Prison. So here was the great emancipator who devoted her life to freedom, and she settled just, a 40-minute walk away from this new form of unfreedom. She lived in the shadow of the prison, and she, in fact, knew many of William Freeman's family members because they went to the same church. They were members of the AME Zion Church. And Harriet Tubman knew William Freeman's family members, and some of them she knew quite well. So it's a really interesting thing to think about, that somebody who devoted her life to freedom chose to live in the shadow of carceral slavery and did not ever write about it. So we don't know what Harriet Tubman thought about carceral slavery. We don't know what she thought about the fact that throughout the second half of her life, more and more Black men were being incarcerated and essentially enslaved 2 miles from her home.
And what was the shower bath torture?
Oh, the shower bath was an enormously tragic thing. As I said, the Auburn State Prison was a very violent place. It's difficult to force people to work for no pay at all, for no benefit of any kind. Really, the only way you can force people to work under those circumstances is through extreme violence. And so the prison was very violent. There was an enormous amount of whipping and beating of prisoners. But then in the 1830s, there was a rise in abolitionism throughout the North. So by this time, most northern states had abolished slavery, and the northern states were beginning to define themselves in opposition to the South, in opposition to Southern slavery. They were beginning to say slavery is not us. Slavery is not who we are. Slavery is not what we stand for. The North was beginning to say this. They were beginning to make their identity be something that was aligned against slavery. And at that point, it became symbolically difficult to see white people in the prison, because remember, most of the people in the prison were white. It became difficult to see white people being whipped, because being whipped was associated with Southern slavery. And so when white people were whipping white people in the prison, all of a sudden this became racially problematic, because it seemed to imply that white people could be Black, and that the prison was likened to slavery in a way that had been seen as very comfortable before the 1830s, but after the 1830s, that seemed like something that they wanted to disavow. So what reformers did was they tried to come up with a new form of punishment that would somehow be more humane than whipping, and that wouldn't have the difficult symbolism and the racial symbolism associated with it. And what they came up with was a machine that could perform waterboarding. So men, and they were all men, were strapped into this horrible machine where ice cold water was dumped over their heads, and they had no ability to protect themselves from that water because they were strapped in kind of like a stocks. The machine looked kind of like stocks, and you can see pictures of it. I wish I could show you a picture of it right now, but there are pictures of it in my book of this horrible invention. Now, of course, waterboarding is a form of torture, and it causes terrible damage to the body, much as whipping is a form of torture and causes terrible damage to the body. The reason that I think this machine for waterboarding was called the shower bath, which was a gross euphemism. One of the reasons I think this is so important is because it shows us something about the nature of reform, and specifically reform with regard to prisons. And of course, one of the points I make in the book is that torture is torture, and torture is always wrong. And this points to some of the difficulties of prison reform. Reform just perpetuates the system. Reform doesn't actually improve the system. What it does is it just helps the system keep on going. And the shower bath is a great example of that. Reformers honestly thought they were improving the system, and instead all they were doing was creating another form of torture and keeping the whole system going.
Well, on that sober note, Professor Bernstein, professor of history and African-American studies of women and gender and sexuality at Harvard University, author of the book Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Lewis Decaro. Find a Black-owned bookstore near you today and get his book, John Brown Speaks, Letters and Statements from Charlestown. Next up, we thank Professor Robin Bernstein from Harvard University and encourage our listeners to find her book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up that favorite bookstore of yours right now and find one of Dr. Gerald Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Babadidan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs your help to pay the bills, to keep the lights on and the mics hot in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.